People find faith or change faiths for many reasons. Sometimes it's for marriage, to please a partner, or when they have kids, because they believe it'll help their children develop morals. Maybe it's after facing a personal crisis, one that leads to a deep analysis of the question, what's it all for? Or maybe it's just to fit in, to find friends and community. But sometimes, whether you're seeking it or not, faith just hits you out of the blue. A feeling, an understanding, a believing takes hold of you. One that you just can't shake. A sense that God is there, and maybe not in the way that you expected. Data show around 30% of people have had spiritual experiences, including almost a fifth of people who are strident atheists. So that raises a question. If you're one of these people, what do you do with that? How does it change who you are, how you live, and even your understanding of what it means to be religious? These are complicated questions, and while I can quote you the statistics, I can't tell you what it actually feels like, or how, if at all, it would change me. So on today's show, we're going to talk with someone who can. New York Times columnist and best-selling author David Brooks. David writes pretty frequently about religion and behavioral science, the two themes at the heart of this show. But when it comes to today's topic, at least, he also lives it.
To me, faith is more like falling in love than it is deciding which car to buy. So it was more a submission to, I would say, things that are the deeper parts of the mind.
On this episode, we're going to talk with David about his own spiritual journey, to understand why faith can come to people when they least expect it, how they can make sense of it, and what it changes for them going forward. I'm Dave DeSteno, and this is How God Works. Hi, David. Thanks for joining us today.
A pleasure to be with you.
I know for the past decade or so, you've been writing a lot about the positive role faith can play in people's lives. Was that always an interest of yours?
Religion was very much in my life, even when I had no faith. I grew up in a Jewish home in New York City. I went to a Christian school, and I went to a Christian camp. So I had both these stories rattling around in my head. After I got married, I kept a kosher home. I sent my kids off to Jewish day school. So just as a social observer, you can't help notice what a strong force religion is in people's lives and in social lives. And in my view, mostly a force for the good.
In your essay for the New York Times where you wrote about finding faith, you wrote that you were looking for belief, or at least to find a set of facts that would convince you that God was either real or not. And so you spent a lot of time reading and analyzing. Why were you looking for God, and why didn't you find the answers in reading those texts?
Well, I was looking for God because I was searching for truth. Maybe he does exist. Like if I could have dinner with anybody on earth in history, I would definitely choose Jesus. Like I have a lot of questions with that guy. I grew up in a culture that I would say that's pretty rationalistic. The idea that we change our lives when we change our rational minds. We weigh evidence. The evidence comes out on one side or the other, and that's how we make decisions. But it seems to me the one part of our creature that is underexplored and underunderstood, including by me, is where our desires come from and how they elevated. Like I can go to the restaurant and I can choose what to order, but I can't choose what I like. I like shrimp, but I hate scallops. I don't know why that is, but it's just the way it is. And so there's something elemental in our nature about our desires that are semi-conscious. And having spent the last 15 or 20 years reading as much neuroscience as I can, as much cognitive science and behavioral sciences, I've just come to have a really healthy respect for the unconscious, for its omnipresence near and its wisdom. Religion touches us at that level.
So I'd say at this point, your background and mine share some similarities. I was raised Catholic, not Jewish. And I'd say growing up, I gave God 50-50 odds of being real. But like you, I had a deeper desire to find out about the nature of the divine and about religion and how to live a good life. I'm still on that journey, as you might tell from me doing this podcast, but you have had experiences that I haven't, ones that started to tip you toward faith and build that over time. And so I'd like to briefly explore that progression.
Yeah, when I was a teenager, I used to lead canoe trips through New England. I remember one morning, I woke up early, it was dawn, I was out walking along at a place called Mount Monadnock, and I had an experience which I think is not uncommon, which is the sense of your own selfhood slipping away and some transcendental contact with the ultimate form of natural beauty. And I think anybody who goes to the redwoods, especially in California, might have some intimations of what that's like. And then a couple times in my life, starting when I was 13, but periodically over the next 20 or 30 years, I would go to Chartres Cathedral in France, about an hour outside of Paris. And maybe it's because my parents are architectural historians. Maybe it's because my early contact with faith was in a beautiful church in New York called Grace Church on 10th Street and Broadway. But Chartres Cathedral has always struck me as sacred ground. And even when I had no faith, somehow you seem to be touching an element of reality that was beyond. And one of the beauties of Chartres is not only a tall, beautiful building, it's a whole cosmology. It tells the story of Christ. On the facade, you have all the different pieces. It was built with incredible mathematical rigor, and there's all sorts of signs embedded in the church mathematically. So if you take the rose window on the front facade and you lay it down, it will go directly on the maze of the floor of the cathedral. It's the exact right height, the exact right size. So there's like a hinting of a divine intelligence here. And so I just found those things, little hints, but they were just hints. And so they didn't really change my life particularly, but they were like glimpses of a beyond.
But for you, it didn't stop there, right? One you mentioned was something that happened to you of all places on the New York City subway. Can you tell us about that?
For visitors who've been to Penn Station in New York, you will be aware that this is the second ugliest spot, maybe on the face of the earth. The only potential uglier spot would be the subway station next to Penn Station, the 8th Avenue line on 33rd Street. And I was there one day, and we're pulling into 33rd Street. And I had the sensation that all the people in the car had these souls, that there was a spiritual element to each of them. And their souls were not just like sitting there glowing. The souls were longing. Some of them were sanctified. Some were sick souls. Some were tired souls. Some were elevated souls. Some were joyous. And the way I would put it for secular audiences is that in each of us has some piece of ourself that has no size, weight, color, or shape, but it gives us infinite value and dignity. And so that soul in us, it yearns. And I think it yearns for goodness. And I do think every little action you take, and this is a C.S. Lewis point, turns that little core piece of yourself, what I'm loftily calling the soul, into something a little more highly elevated or a little more degraded. And so if I listen to a beautiful piece of music, I think I've elevated my soul. And if I spend my life watching Twitter, I think I've degraded my soul. And so I think we carve that piece of ourselves with our daily choice.
So David, I want to push you on something here. As scientists, right, we know that these types of spiritual experiences happen. They're not rare. It's also the case that faith isn't a prerequisite for them. And we also know that they correspond to certain types of brain activity that we can measure. And we can induce them by giving people things like ayahuasca or psilocybin or having them engage in deep prayer or meditation. You know the neuroscience literature. Why didn't you just write this off as a biological reaction, a brain glitch of sorts? Isn't that an easier answer?
It is an answer, but I guess the way it manifests to me is not just as a mere sensation, though it starts with a sensation, but a sensation that leads to something. And I think it leads to the Bible. A friend of mine named Christian Wyman, who teaches at Yale, says religion is not just those moments that seem transcendent. It's an attempt to make those moments not just interruptions in our life, but somehow to account them as part of reality.
So when people have those spiritual experiences like you had, some people write them off. Some people see them as inspirational. As a society, do you think we should be looking for more enchantment in life? Or that is, does relying on logic and the need for proof and solid belief lead to a disenchantment that makes us not engage with these experiences in a way that could help us flourish?
Yeah, I think I'd make the distinction that there are some transcendent experiences that it doesn't really reveal anything to you about the
Mm,
universe. And some experiences are what they call illuminations.
mm.
They permanently alter the way you see the world. So my little event in the subway car, where I saw people have souls, so I would say that experience wasn't only a moment, it was a lesson. And if you think people have souls, then it's a pretty short step to thinking there's a soul giver. And so while I would say these transcendent experiences are the first step of faith, they're only the first step. Aviva Zornberg wrote a book called The Particulars of Rapture about the Exodus story. And she has a concept there when Hebrew slaves were in Egypt. She says their lives were so hard they were unmusicked. They didn't sing. But then as they're crossing the Red Sea, Miriam breaks out into song. And she says they've been remusicked. That felt resonant to me, that you can go through life spiritually and emotionally restrained, I would say, and then you can get a little more emotionally and spiritually opened and more alive.
You were raised Jewish, as you said, although exposed a lot to Christianity. How do you define yourself now?
I tell people I'm religiously bisexual. And my Jewish friends say, listen, if you're reading the Gospel of Matthew, you've gone over to the other team, which is absolutely fair. And so, I spend more time going to church than to synagogues. But I have to say, I feel more Jewish now than ever before. Because before I read the book of Exodus, man, I thought a nice story. Now I think it's fundamentally true. Maybe not literally true, but profoundly true. And then when you make this kind of transition, you realize you can take the boy out of Judaism, but you can't take Judaism out of the boy. And so, like, for example, when I'm in conversation with Christian circles, I have to tone down my humor level. And I don't want to be too Jewy. And I have to turn down my argument level. Like, one of the nice things about Judaism is that it really is, argument is a form of prayer. Well, that's how I think, through argument. And that's not quite the way that it works in the Christian world. The biggest difference is, in the Christian world, I sometimes hear people saying, I'm going to take my hand off the wheel and let God steer. But in the Jewish tradition, as much as I understand it, we're involved in an act of co-creation with God. There's a lot more agency. And I think one of the reasons Jews have trouble thinking about the afterlife is, if it's perfect, there's nothing left to do. And so who would want to go there? And so I find that I can never totally surrender my will to God's grace.
But what do you say to people who are very creedal and who basically say, well, you can't be both. You have to be one or the other.
I accept that you probably have to be one or the other, but I would amend that in a couple of ways. One, I'd point out that Jesus was actually a Jewish guy. He didn't talk about creating a new religion that was separate. I think the separation between these two religions is partially an artifact of 2,000 years of Christian anti-Semitism. And it's an artifact of two different cultures that define themselves as the opposite of the other. But I frankly don't think they are opposite of the other. I don't think there's anything. I talked about how beautiful I thought the Beatitudes are. There's really nothing in there that isn't contained in the Old Testament. Jesus was very much growing out of that tradition and thought he was speaking into it.
Hmm.
And so I accept that, creed does matter, but I think the difference that we attribute to Judaism and Christianity was not there in the first century.
There is a tradition of mystics in all of these traditions, right? Those seekers who have had experiences kind of like yours. They often embrace a more non-traditional, less dogmatic approach to faith. And it's often a reason why they're looked at with some suspicion by traditionalists. Do you think having had these experiences alters the way you respond to strict dogma or the authorities in these traditions?
Yeah, well, I'm not a dogmatic person, so I'm a great faith in human fallibility. When I look at the mystics, I realize I'm nowhere in their league. But when I look at St. Augustine, he was among the most brilliant minds I've ever encountered. And he felt a restlessness, as he put it, we are restless until we rest in you. Now, I think that restlessness should tell us something. I don't think it proves the existence of God because, like, I'm restless to be able to dunk a basketball. I'm never going to be able to do that. It doesn't mean anything. Just restless for things beyond my means. But I do think that Augustine's centrality of yearning tells us something, and the fact that we yearn for something doesn't mean it exists, but it could mean we're wired in a certain way to that kind of yearning. And I have a lot of atheist and secular friends who have yearnings, but it's not quite the same. But I think it's a yearning for beauty, beautiful goodness. I think that's almost a human universal.
You said something pretty profound there, and it's that faith isn't necessarily a possession or a certainty of something you have like a fact, right? It's better conceived of as a yearning. What does that flipping it in that way do for us?
Well, it means you're not like seeking faith just as solace, as the opium of the masses. Rabbi Joseph Soloveitchik, who was a 20th century great scholar, he wrote that faith is like going down the rapids of a river. There are moments when you hit the rocks, there are moments of soaring. It's just tumult. And so one of the things I learned about faith, it isn't like once you achieve it, you reach some stasis point where it's all serene. And you think, oh, I've got eternal life, goody goody, let's go. It's an even more torturous journey, I would say, after you have faith than before you have faith. Because the demands, the obligations, the goals, the aspirations are higher. At least they were for me. And it was an act of raising what I wanted out of life.
What is knowing God like for you? How do you perceive God?
I guess, you perceive him as grace. I actually felt grace before I felt God. And that is the notion that we don't live in a cold, meaningless universe, that there is some fundamental structure of love in the universe that exists between human beings, exists between us and our children, it exists between us and our towns, between beauty.
And then what happens on those darker days when you feel most separated from God? Do you have those days of loss of faith or separation?
Since I experience faith as longing, some days I'm enthusiastically longing, and some days I suffer what the medievals called acedia, which is a lack of longing, a loss of desire. And I have to say, the days when I suffer from acedia, loss of desire, those are great days. Like
Why?
I don't think about it at all. I follow the New York Mets. I read the New York Times. Like it's fine. It's nothing, no big deal. And so maybe I'm not experiencing life in all its dimensions as in other days, but I found I can go weeks or months without feeling anything. And some days it's just not there. Some days it's not even doubt. It's just apathy. But then other days it feels real. And so that's good enough for me.
Are you ever intentional about trying to get that yearning strong again at times?
I mean, the traditional way is through spiritual disciplines. It's through fasting. It's through prayer. I confess I don't like fasting. It makes me hungry. And I suck at prayer because if you're a journalist, I'm like, oh, this prayer lacks structure. It's a little repetitive. Like I'm like editing my prayers. I'm going along. I was once asked to pray for some people who were suffering in Syria. And my prayer when it came out was like, I hope the UN passes all the relevant resolutions. I hope the safe zone. It was like I'd written a newspaper column. And so I don't experience like that. And maybe just because the way I raised and the job I do, I experience it through reading, frankly. It's in spiritual reading, which is a divine practice. That's where I feel the juice.
In some ways, I like to say, religion, the practices of it, curate our emotions and our goals for us simultaneously. And for some people, maybe it's one more than the other, depending upon the route that you get there. These practices have an ancient wisdom that tweaks our mind and bodies in a way that gives us that juice, as you're saying. But I think for us to succeed, to reach our goals, to do hard things and become a better person, we have to have plans, but we also have to have a deep motivation. And it's those emotions that make us do things when they're hard. One or the other of those isn't going to work. The goal and the strategy without the fire and the feeling to do it won't last. The fire and the feeling that's not channeled into productive tools and practices is probably going to lead us to flail. And so I worry when people are just saying, I'm going to become spiritual. And I say, what does that mean? Then they're like, well, I'm going to take this piece of this religion and this piece of this other thing, that trying to assemble things in new ways and without having a community around you may not get you where you want to go.
Yeah, there was a famous book called Habits of the Heart by Robert Bellah and a bunch of other people. And in the first few pages of that book, they interview a woman who said, my religion is Sheilaism. And her name is Sheila. And she had picked out some bits of this and bits of that. My problem with that was when you treat religion that way, A, you're probably not as smart as the entire Muslim tradition or the entire Buddhist tradition. Like, there are reasons these traditions exist and they've been cohered over centuries. Second, you're probably going to choose a faith that doesn't really challenge you to do what you don't want to do. It's like the faith of nature. If you go out and have a religious experience in the forest, as I have, it doesn't really ask anything of you. It just confirms what you already thought. Religion is a form of obligation. And so it's a social enterprise. It involves rules, it involves sacrifices, and all spiritual disciplines. So without that, I think you're adrift.
What is religion for, in your view, right? Part of finding a new faith, or even a faith at all, if you're coming from someone who is not really a believer, part of it is a drive usually to be a better person. And even, if it starts out as a selfish way to do that, if you do religion right, it'll move us toward the other-centered ways that you mentioned, toward service, toward love, toward compassion. And those things, research shows, and religion knew a long time ago, will bring you joy. But there's another part to this, right? Part of being a better person is making the society, the world, a better place too, ensuring justice, healing divides, basically being an active force for good. In Judaism, I think the idea is of, tikkun olam, repairing the world. Do you see that as an essential part of being a spiritual person?
I think it is central aspiration. So anybody who read about the Crusades knows the ways the religion can be turned into awful things. Rabbi Jonathan Sacks, who died maybe 2 years ago, who was the official rabbi of Great Britain, he said that we have religious wars not because they're religious, because religions are groups. And groups tend to fight with one another. And so I don't want to say that religions being groupish are going to lead to eternal peace. It's obviously not true. But I do think, I'll just speak for myself, they've raised my hopes for what I make out of my life. I run a little nonprofit called Weave, the Social Fabric Project, and we celebrate people who live lives of incredible altruism. They serve their communities, they serve the poor, and I'd say half are religious and half are not religious. But in some of the religious ones, I notice almost a astounding level of endurance. I think faith gives an extra boost to those who are really leading lives of sacrificial service. And again, I know plenty of people who are secular who lead amazing lives, but somehow I just noticed that willing to totally unself yourself is sometimes boosted by people of profound faith.
But how do you do it right? And the reason I ask that is because we all know people who profess deep faith who can be quite cruel and dishonest.
Yeah. And I would say it's they don't have what they call the fruits of the Spirit. It's very powerful, and I see it in my political coverage every day, to have a faith that's more Nietzsche than Jesus. That's really about the will to power. And, I'm simplifying Nietzsche. I'm not giving him credit, but I do think when you get people with a siege mentality who feel their status, their safety is under threat, their views are under threat, they will throw out the Gospels for the sake of power.
Are those fruits of the Spirit, those numinous experiences you talk about? Because we know, and I'm not going to make a claim of where it comes from, but we know from the scientific literature that feeling awe, feeling gratitude, those things make us more other-oriented, more moral, more honest.
I do think those emotions of awe and wonder drive us toward something beyond ourselves. They introduce humility, always a good thing, but then they elevate aspiration. When I had my moments, it wasn't like I'd had a mystery solved. I'd had a mysterious realm open up. And I think awe and wonder sort of points you in that, there's something grander here that I don't understand. And that's bound to, I hope, elevate your spirit. The phrase fruits of the Spirit is the one I learned 10 or 15 years ago. And I don't know how to express it, except sometimes you meet people that are just wonderfully joyous. And they radiate joy all the time. I once was seated in a Washington think tank next to the Dalai Lama. And it was odd because he didn't say anything profound to me at all. I was hoping like words of wisdom. But he just started laughing. And he would laugh, and it was awkward, so I would laugh, and he would laugh, and I would laugh. But just to be around that guy, I think that's the fruits of the Spirit, and he does hours and hours of meditation every day. And he just greets the world with joy. Sort of default awe, wonder, gratitude, joy.
Do you think in your case, did you find faith or did faith find you? And by that I mean, why you? Why did you have these experiences, do you think? And is it just as likely to happen to anyone?
I think it's likely to happen to anyone. And believe me, I live a pretty mundane, shallow life. I don't think of myself as a spiritually or emotionally deep guy. So I'm not like some spiritual giant who's experiencing the farthest intimations of the universe. And I guess, Christian Wyman, who I quoted before, he said, I search for God, or is it you searching for me? And it's really hard to tell the difference between those two things. Some people I know deeply want to be religious, but as a friend of mine says, I just never experienced anything like that. I just don't have the gene. And I would have considered myself in that camp for a long time. And so it came as a bit of a surprise how it happened. And it hasn't frankly altered my life all that much, but I hope it's made me humbler and a little deeper and frankly a little more capable of feeling, and which is a good thing to have. And I would say religion has had that effect of making me sometimes really happy and sometimes really sad. And so I don't think it was totally like my will that it made it happen, because I didn't particularly chase it. I didn't decide this year, my New Year's resolution, I'm going to be religious by the end of the year. Some people describe faith as a series of convictions, like I have these certain ideas and I believe in them. But I think a lot of people experience it as a longing, as a form of longing. To me, faith is more like falling in love than it is deciding which car to buy. It was more a submission to, I would say, things that are the deeper parts in mind. It's like so many of our growth periods. It's an interaction.
And for people like your friend who hasn't had the experience but just feels like they can't believe, in my realm, being a social scientist, I have a lot of people who say, well, Dave, there's no evidence for this. And so William James, the father of modern psychology, as you know, in quote, spent a lot of time studying religious experiences, something I'm trying to get my colleagues to do. And he had this notion of something called an overbelief, by which he meant beliefs for which you lack sufficient evidence, but which you're justified in adopting because of their beneficial effects. And here he said our feelings, right, our emotions are a type of evidence. And so for him, choosing to believe, in this case, in the spiritual, was quite rational because there was no evidence clearly contradicting it. And as he saw it, there were some benefits to it. And I think, these centuries later, we're seeing that, right? People who are engaged in religion, not just saying I believe in God, but are engaged in religion, have better physical health, mental health outcomes, find more meaning, find more joy in life. And so, do you think that sometimes belief and rationality get in the way?
In my life, every day. I think rationality is a great blessing, but also a great intimidator. The fact that many, many, many brilliant people believe it is not proof of anything, but it's a little hint that maybe they're onto something. At least it's a hint not to take the attitude that there's nothing rational here. There's nothing evidence-based here. Like William James and others can say, well, there's no evidence here. But Thomas Aquinas was a pretty bright guy. He believed. Augustine was astoundingly brilliant. He believed. Pascal was the greatest mathematician of his age. And he had what he called his night of fire, when he felt holiness pervading him. I have a friend, and when her first child was born, she realized she loved her more than evolution required. And I've always liked that, because obviously we are evolved creatures, and we evolved to cooperate and do all the things that our genes want us to do. But to me, that logic has never really explained human life. It doesn't explain the altruistic goodness I see in people all around me. And so I've always thought evolution obviously guides our behavior. And I read evolutionary psychologists on love. I never think they get the whole part of it. And so to me, the beauty of religion, like the beauty of love, grow out of how we were made. And we were made, as Augustine said, as desiring creatures, as longing for something beyond.
The human capacity for awe and wonder is very old, much more so than institutional religion. But religion can provide a framework to understand that awe and to channel it. So if you're one of the 30% who have had a spiritual illumination and aren't sure what to make of it, know that it doesn't have to fundamentally change your life. You don't need to join a monastery or give away all your belongings to honor it. Like David, you can choose simply to yearn for the divine as you live your life, and realize that some days it might be a bit further away than you'd like. But the wisdom in religious traditions can provide a framework to use that spiritual experience to grow. It'll help you set your moral compass. And so even if you get blown off course now and again, you can find your way back to your true north. And if you're like me and the other 70% of people who haven't had a spiritual experience, and probably just see the 33rd Street subway station as the dregs of New York City, that's okay too. Gratitude, awe, love, and kindness, these are things we can all cultivate. You can buy the science-backed wisdom these offer, even while you're debating whether they're gifts from God. In the end, they'll lead to the same place. Next time on How God Works, the belief that consciousness exists beyond the human mind, in trees, animals, maybe even the tiniest particles of matter, might sound pretty out there. But it's not as new as you might think.
It seems like something that we might call hippie in a slightly derogatory way. But actually, it's the position that the majority of humans have probably adopted across the majority of countries over the majority of history.
Now, some philosophers and scientists are giving that ancient idea a second look and asking whether it can help explain the nature of reality.
I don't think we can get consciousness out of physics. That project has gone nowhere, but we can get physics out of consciousness. We know that can be done.
How God Works is hosted by me, Dave DeSteno. This episode was written by Josie Holtzman and me. Our senior producer is Josie Holtzman. Our producer is Sophie Eisenberg. Our associate producer is Emmanuel Desarme. Executive producer is Genevieve Sponsler. Merritt Jacob is our mix engineer and composed our theme, which was arranged by Chloe DeSteno. The executive producer of PRX Productions is Jocelyn Gonzalez. This podcast was also made possible with support from the John Templeton Foundation. To learn more about the show and access episode transcripts, you can find our website at howgodworks, all one word, howgodworks.org. And for news and peeks at what's coming, feel free to follow us on Instagram at HowGodWorksPod, or me on X or Blue Sky at David DeSteno.